Hey, in this video, I want to share 6 tips with you that I think can help you be better prepared the next time you want to submit an abstract for a conference CFP. Now, these are tips that I have been following personally, so my goal is by the end of this video for you to have learned a few new tips that will help you the next time you are submitting a proposal for a conference. So let's jump into the tips. So the first tip that I want to share is kind of a simple one, but I think it's actually quite important, and that is to pick topics for your proposals that you are actually interested in. And now the reason I say this is kind of twofold. One, something that you are interested in or have firsthand experience with is going to allow you to kind of better prepare the abstract and then potentially the talk if it gets accepted, because you'll be more interested in it, you'll be more willing to do the research, and you will have more experience to draw on to be able to kind of craft that submission and make it understandable to whoever is reviewing it. Now, the second reason I say to only submit proposals for topics that you're actually interested in is because if it does get selected, it's a lot of work to actually write a conference talk. So you don't want to have to write a talk for a topic that you don't actually care about. It just doesn't sound like a pleasant experience because it does take a lot of work. So keep that in mind, make things easier on yourself, and only submit proposals for topics that you actually want to talk about. So my second tip is to not worry about whether or not your chosen topic might be selected by somebody else. If you know that there is likely to be someone submitting something around the same topic, or maybe you've talked to someone and they think that they are going to as well, don't let that discourage you from submitting your own take on that. Again, that's where actually having some personal interest or some personal experience with the topic is really going to become important for you, because it's going to let you really craft your own take on that subject. You could have multiple people give a talk on the same exact thing, and all of those talks might end up being very different because of your unique perspective, your unique way of speaking or presenting information. So there's nothing wrong with submitting a talk on a topic that somebody else is. Don't let that discourage you, and I think you should go ahead and go for it. Now, tip number 3 is to tell a story with your proposal. And what I'm talking about here is you want to sort of guide the reader through the journey that you have gone through and plan to take your audience through. So what this might look like is kind of setting up the problem or hinting at what problem you were trying to solve. Then talking about what you did or what you learned to help solve that problem. And then maybe what the resolution was. What were the outcomes? What tools did you use? What solutions did you come up with? Now, let's look at an example of what this might look like. So let's say I was going to create a talk about self-care. Now we'll look at this example that's maybe a rough idea of what this idea might look like. So this first line, in this talk, I'll tell you what I learned about self-care. So you're starting off and you're kind of giving them right off the bat sort of what this talk is going to be about. So now we've kind of set the stage. Next up, you'll hear about the challenges I faced, the lessons I learned, and how I've benefited from more self-care in my life. So right there, we have kind of a 3-part story. We mentioned the challenges we faced, the lessons that were learned, and the benefits from that, or what that outcome was. So right there, we sort of outlined the journey we're going to go on. We're going to say, all right, we're going to start at the beginning and the problem. We're going to go through what was learned, what solutions were come up with, and then at the end, we're going to look at what that outcome was. Now, in a real proposal, this will need to be more detailed, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But this is a nice example of sort of this idea of telling a story in your proposal. So whatever topic it is, try and structure it in maybe a similar way starting out. What was the challenge you faced? What solutions did you consider? And what was the final outcome? So the fourth tip is to expand on this idea of telling a story. Now, stories are more relevant and interesting if we can see ourselves in them. And this is very true when you are crafting an abstract proposal for a conference. Whoever is reading this is going to want to know what they are going to get out of it, and by extension, what the audience is going to get out of it. So if you can craft your abstract with that in mind, you might be able to help your reader and your audience relate more with that proposal. So let's see an example of what that might look like. So here is the example we were just looking at. And you might notice that this is using a lot of I language. In this talk, I'll tell you what I learned about self-care. You'll hear about the challenges I face, the lessons I learned, and how I've benefited from more self-care in my life. So this is telling the audience the general idea of the talk. It's very focused on sort of you as the writer or the presenter. So a better way to go about this would be to turn it around and focus on what the reader and the audience might take away from this. So here's kind of a different example of that same proposal, but focused more on you language. So in this case, it now reads, in this talk, you'll learn about why self-care is important and how it has impacted my life and could impact yours. You'll learn about the challenges I faced, lessons learned, and how you might benefit from adding more self-care practices to your weekly routines. So now the reader, and again by extension the audience, can start to see themselves in this talk. They can start to see how they can relate to what the challenges were. They can start to relate to what the outcomes are going to be, or why this is relevant to them and they might be interested. So it's a very subtle change, but by changing your I language to you language, you can greatly increase the effectiveness of your proposal. Okay, so now that we know that we want to keep our proposals really focused on the reader and the audience, my next tip is to keep your proposals short and to the point. When writing an abstract, it's tempting to try and pack in as much information as possible to really give the reviewer a good understanding of what your talk is going to be about. Now, this makes sense. I've definitely done this in the past. However, this can actually lead to your proposal being more difficult to sort of understand, which is going to probably reduce the likelihood of it getting selected. Now, a big reason behind this is because reviewers often have to review a lot of talks at once. So they're going to be looking at them very quickly. And the more quickly that they can understand the main takeaways and read through your proposal, the better your odds are going to be that they enjoy that proposal and want to select it. So an example of what this looks like is right here. We've kind of taken that proposal that we saw before, which looked like this. It was just a couple of sentences, and it kind of gave you that clear outline of what was going to be discussed. But it expands on that in a lot more detail. So it starts to talk more in depth about the struggles that they faced and what they're going through and the results of that and how deep into that problem space they were in. And then talking much more again about the challenges and then finally what the takeaways are going to be. And it's all kind of good information. It's certainly information that might come up in the talk. However, we've now tripled or quadrupled the amount of information the reviewer has to read to understand what this talk is about. So keep your proposals really short and to the point. Make it very easy to parse and understand what you're going to discuss. So favor kind of this short version as opposed to a much longer and more wordy version if you can. And the final tip that I want to share with you for improving your conference talk proposals is to make your takeaways very clear and easy to find within your abstract text. So what does this look like? Well, we've already talked about, defining your story, defining what your takeaways are going to be. Now, keeping your proposal short can help with this, but I think you can go even further with this by really actually calling out those items in the text specifically. So one way I like to do this is by separating these things on their own line or even with bullet points. So again, taking this example we've been working with, I've updated it, and now we can see that I've mentioned that you'll learn about the challenges I faced and lessons learned. So that is now kind of its own takeaway on a separate line. I then mention several specific self-care practices that we'll talk about and then list those off with bullet points. So now the reviewer can see specifically that this talk will include some talk about diet, exercise, and daily journaling. And then finally, to kind of wrap everything together, we'll dive into how you might benefit from adding more practices to your routine. So now we can kind of see those 3 high-level takeaways and several specifics that go into greater detail. So now the reviewer has several things in their mind when they are thinking about whether to recommend this talk or not. And they can have a good picture of sort of how the talk might go and what it's going to be covered, and ultimately whether it's going to be of interest to the conference attendees that they are thinking about. Now, this has been a pretty trivial example, and if I was going to be submitting this to an actual proposal, I'd probably try and add some more specifics here. But this does give, I think, a pretty good general outline and some rules with which to follow. Remember to pick a topic that you're interested in. Don't worry about whether other people might be doing it or not. You want to keep your points short and to the point. You want to tell a story and use you language so that the reader and audience can better relate. And you want to try and keep things nice and concise. All right, that's it. Those are 6 quick tips that hopefully will help you next time you are preparing an abstract for a conference talk submission. I hope that will increase your chances of getting accepted, and I look forward to hearing all about your next conference talk. Until next time.